In this lesson, I'd like to try and answer 8 different questions that people commonly have about the concentration camps. Now, some of the details will be horrific, but I think it is important to face the truth in part so that we can hopefully avoid similar tragedies in the future. Our first question is, who invented the concentration camps? This is an important question because people often assume that the Nazis did, but in fact, many European nations used concentration camps before World War II. For example, in the late 19th century, in Cuba, the Spanish used a reconcentration strategy when they were fighting the Cuban rebels. Over 500,000 people were placed in camps, and in just 2 years, over 170,000 had died. Similarly, in the Boer War in South Africa, the English used concentration camps as well. Over 100,000 Boers were interned and thousands died. And for context here, the Boers were the descendants of Dutch immigrants to South Africa. What had happened was that in the late 19th century, gold had been discovered in Witwatersrand, and as a result, people flocked to this place. There was conflict between British settlers and the Boers, and increasingly the English wanted to establish their authority, and they used a scorched earth policy where they destroyed crops and residences. They put people in concentration camps, and they tried to separate families from the fighters. So this particular strategy was widely condemned, including in England. People protested against it, but with little effect. If we move then to northern Africa, in Libya, the Italians used concentration camps in the 2 decades before World War II. Thousands of people were interned and died, and this is also an example of genocide, where there is an attempt to kill many people of the same ethnic group. If we then go back again to the southern part of Africa, you can see on this map that the Germans themselves had a number of African colonies. They're colored yellow, not as many colonies as some other European nations, but they nevertheless had a lot of control over African territory. And zooming in then to the bottom left, where we have Namibia, this is a map from 1911, we can see that the Germans ruled here as well. So in Namibia, the German colonial forces destroyed a lot of the native population, and they placed many of these tribal people, including from the Herero and Nama people, in concentration camps. Now, if we then move to World War II, it's not entirely surprising that some Dutch people actually thought that not just the Germans might be enemies, but they also had suspicions of other colonial powers. So in the book Journey Through the Night, there is one character, a teacher, who had family that was in a concentration camp during the Boer Wars. And one of the characters in this book explains his father was killed by the English during the Boer Wars, and he and his mother were prisoners in an English concentration camp. You've probably heard the story of how the English imprisoned thousands of women and children in order to make the Boers stop fighting. Many died of starvation and sickness. After the war, his mother came to the Netherlands to join her family, but she never recovered from those days in that English concentration camp. She died young. And then the person who's saying this, the father figure in the text, he says to his son, "You may hate evil and injustice, in fact you should, but not the English or the Germans." In other words, the camps themselves are evil, but that doesn't mean that we should hate all the people of that particular nation. And that was, of course, difficult to do for people who had been through it. And after World War II, it also became difficult for many other folks as well. So hopefully that helps give a little bit of context so that we can see that even though the Nazis escalated things to an unimaginable level and killed millions of people in the concentration camps, we can see that even before the war, other nations had done similar things. So let's move on to our second question then. How did the Nazis differentiate between prisoners in the camps? And what they commonly did was they gave people badges to wear on their clothes. So you can see all these different colored triangle badges, and this is how they distinguished between people. Political prisoners, Jehovah's Witnesses, career criminals, homosexuals, and so on. It's interesting that the Jehovah's Witnesses were some of the first people in the camps. They refused military service and they would not give the Hitler salute, and Hitler really distrusted them and had many of them placed in camps. The Nazis also used other designations to add more detail. For example, a red bar with a triangle suggested that a political offender was a repeat offender. If a Jehovah's Witness came from Poland, a P might be added, and so on and so forth. And of course, every prisoner also had a prisoner number. Our third question then is, did German soldiers have a choice? And this is a difficult question to answer. Soldiers helped in many different ways. Some of them helped to hoard people into cattle cars. Other people served in the gas chambers. And it's easy to say, well, they were all guilty. But then what about the people on the sidelines? People who maybe kind of knew what was happening, but were putting their head in the sand and didn't really want to know. People involved in administration. It becomes a bigger question in terms of, well, who is all responsible for this? But if we just focus on soldiers, in the book Eichmann in Jerusalem, Hannah Arendt, who was a prominent 20th century Jewish philosopher, she pointed out that SS members, people involved in exterminating the Jews, could ask for a transfer to somewhere else. They could ask not to be involved. And typically, if they did, they were able to get their request fulfilled. So she writes, "We know how surprisingly easy it was for members of the extermination squads to quit their jobs without serious consequences for themselves. In the Nuremberg documents," and remember that the Nuremberg trials happened after the war, "not a single case could be traced in which an SS member had suffered the death penalty because of a refusal to take part in an execution." The picture here, by the way, is of SS officer Adolf Eichmann. That's what her book is about. And he was involved at the highest level. He was there at the Wannsee Conference, for instance, when the plans were made to exterminate the Jews in large numbers. And he oversaw a lot of the transport of the Jews to the concentration camps. So he himself argued this point that he was just doing his duty. He had no choice. And Arendt wanted to point out that this was not really true. Our fourth question then is, well, how did the executioners soothe their conscience? How did they deal with the fact that they were doing horrible things? First of all, it's important to know that behind the front lines, initially, the Germans used special units called Einsatzkommandos, which are task forces for a special purpose. And so at first, they used these mobile killing squads. They executed hundreds of thousands of people by just lining them up, shooting them, and digging mass graves for them, or having them dig the graves before they died. This was traumatic for those people as well, for the executioners, and the Nazis later started to use gas chambers to make the process faster, and to some extent less visible as well. So it was important then to try to desensitize the people involved, the SS officers, the soldiers, and so on. A number of strategies were used. Alcohol was a major one. Another one was to remind people that they were doing their duty. And in fact, the motto of the SS became, "My honor is loyalty." In other words, if I'm just doing my duty, I'm loyal to Adolf Hitler, then that is my honor. I don't have to think about whether it's right or not. They were also often told that they were making a difference historically. In other words, they were part of a larger European project to create a better racial society, to do something epic, and so they felt they were part of a bigger plan. And then finally, self-pity played a major role. So Hannah Arendt, if we return to her, she actually writes, "The trick used by Himmler was very simple and probably very effective. It consisted in turning these instincts of feeling pity around, as it were, in directing them towards the self, so that instead of saying, 'What horrible things I did to people,' the murderers would be able to say, 'What horrible things I had to watch in the pursuance of my duties. How heavily the task weighed upon my shoulders.' And in this way, they could feel that it was difficult for them and not for their victims." Our fifth question is, well, why did many Jews help the Nazis? And this is something that we have to come to terms with. First of all, we have to realize that much of the work in the concentration camps was done by former criminals, also Jews and other prisoners, and the people who acted as guards were referred to as capos. So these capos, they were kind of the chieftains or the leaders in the camps, prisoners themselves, but they had a tremendous amount of authority. Many of them were vicious criminals. Many of them were seen as traitors, but not all were evil. Some were just trying to survive themselves, and some of them could be lenient at times. If we turn to a very important book, Primo Levi's The Drowned and the Saved, Primo Levi was an Auschwitz survivor, we see that he writes, in other words, they were free, these are the capos, they were free to commit the worst atrocities on their subjects as punishment for any transgressions, or even without any motive whatsoever. Until the end of 1943, it was not unusual for a prisoner to be beaten to death by a capo without the latter having to fear any sanctions. Only later on, when the need for labor became more acute, were a number of limitations introduced. The mistreatment the capos were allowed to inflict on the prisoners could not permanently diminish their working ability. So, having looked then at why some Jewish people did help along, sometimes shamefully and sometimes understandably, the next question is, why did so few prisoners rebel? And here too, Primo Levi has some really great insights. First of all, most prisoners were too physically exhausted to do anything. Primo Levi writes, the typical prisoner, the one who represented the camp's core, was at the limits of depletion, hungry, weakened, covered with sores, and therefore profoundly downcast. He was a rag of a man. And in this context, we also have to remember that people had to work hard in the camps. The ironic slogan of the camps was Arbeit macht frei, labor makes free, as if you just did enough work you could be liberated. But that, of course, was never the case. Another reason Primo Levi provides is that there was a lack of leadership. He writes, it is never the most oppressed individuals who stand at the heads of movements. Usually, in fact, revolutions are led by bold, open-minded leaders who throw themselves into the fray out of generosity or perhaps ambition, even though they personally could have a secure and tranquil, perhaps even privileged life. It's an interesting argument that it takes a special kind of person to be a leader, and not always the victim or the oppressed person, but somebody who wants to help out and who perhaps themselves is already privileged. Another reality that we have to face is that if people did rebel, the outcome was almost always failure. And Primo Levi gives the example of the Auschwitz Sonderkommandos, special commands or special units of prisoners that were in charge of the gas chambers. And over time there were 12 squads of these in succession, and this is a horrible detail. At its initiation, the next squad burned the corpses of its predecessors. In October 1944, the last squad rebelled against the SS, blew up one of the crematoria, and was exterminated in an unequal battle. So when they finally did try to rebel, they simply had no chance and they were destroyed. Two more questions to go here. So first of all, were all the Germans to blame? Now, in the hiding place, there's an interesting passage in chapter 13 when Corrie comes to Ravensbrück, and she writes, we passed a number of local people on foot and in horse-drawn wagons. The children especially seemed wonderful to me, pink-cheeked and healthy. They returned my stares with wide-eyed interest. I noticed, however, that the adults did not look at us, but turned their heads away as we approached. And this shows us that most Germans knew roughly what was going on, especially later in the war. At first they could ignore it, but the rumors got out, and people had a pretty good sense that horrible things were happening. And yet many of them ignored it and did nothing. Now what that means is that we still have to have different levels of blame, because obviously a Nazi leader is much more to blame than an ordinary citizen, but people still have to face their own sense of responsibility, and we can't just say, well, I couldn't have done anything. I mean, at the very least, you could voice a protest and say something, write a letter. There's always some things that you can do. Our final question is, did the Nazis perform medical experiments in the camps? And the unfortunate truth is that they did. One of the more prominent experiments involved sulfa drugs. So what had happened was that the Allies had discovered a wonder drug that was saving many of their soldiers. And this drug was penicillin. Soldiers often died from gas gangrene, infected tissue, and blood poisoning, and the Allies were saving many of their wounded soldiers. The Germans were struggling to find a wonder drug of their own, and so they wondered whether sulfa drugs might do the trick. For that reason, at Ravensbrück, some female prisoners were injected with bacteria to imitate the same condition of infection. Doctors then administered sulfa drugs and they watched the results. Patients often ended up with horribly mutilated limbs and terrible pain, and some, of course, died. Patients were also blindfolded, and as a survivor later said, the important doctors didn't want witnesses because they knew they'd be shot for it. So the doctors knew very well that what they were doing was inhumane and completely illegal. Other examples include breaking people's bones to see how they would heal. They would hit them with hammers just to see how the healing process would go. They would place prisoners in cold water in order to see how sailors might survive in the ocean. And sometimes they would amputate entire limbs to see if they could transplant them. What we have seen then by looking at these 8 different questions is that the concentration camps were places of incredible torture and inhumanity. And it's really important that even though this is a difficult subject, we don't shy away from it, but we remember the past, because that's the only way that we can try to prevent similar things from happening in the future.